Fallacies and Facts by Edward Minton. Many money reformers suppose that it is the charging of interest which accounts for the ever-increasing debt in the world. When banks create money by making a loan, they don't create or issue any money with which the interest may be paid, so they say that debt must increase. When unpaid interest of 5% is added to a debt, it will double in 14 years, and it doubles in 7 years at 10% interest. Nevertheless, this is not what causes our debt to the banks to increase. Blaming interest makes for a good story, but it simply isn't so. The reason that interest doesn't compound our debt to the banks is to be found in the way that bank receipts are accounted. All private banks keep a shareholders' account. All receipts, whether for interest, fees, or items of other descriptions, are paid into this shareholders' account. From this account, all expenses are paid. Salaries, office rent, stationery, computers, and so on. Any interest paid on deposits is also paid from this account. At the end of a period, usually half-yearly, what remains in the account is designated as profit. While varying with different banks, this net profit is less than half the interest paid to them. On average, 70% of this net profit, after company tax, is then distributed to shareholders by way of a dividend. Thus far, all but 30% of the bank's net profit is returned into the community in some way. This 30% is retained as reserves, and depending upon how these reserves are kept, much of this money may also be returned into the community. If banks buy shares or real estate out of reserves, bank assets increase, of course, but debt to them does not. Of every $1 they receive in interest, at least 50 cents goes back into the community in paying the bank's costs. Of the remaining 50 cents, another 15 cents is paid in company tax. Of the remaining 35 cents, 70% is paid to shareholders as dividends, which is about 25 cents, so the bank retains 10 cents. As they use this as reserves and buy assets, they get richer, but they also disperse most of this 10 cents remaining into the community in doing so. It's doubtful that as much as 2 cents in every dollar paid in interest to them is retained in the form of money reserves. Debt everywhere in the world is, however, increasing by about 10% every year, except for years of recession. If interest charges are not causing this, then what is? This has been well argued in theory by men such as C.H. Douglas and John Maynard Keynes, but theories are not always necessary in the presence of facts. The facts about a corporation's well-being are to be found in their books of account, and particularly in their profit and loss accounts. Nations are the only large entities which never do profit and loss accounts. Even the United States, mighty nation that it is, has never done such an account to show the income paid to their people to induce them to produce against the value of the consumer goods so produced. A few Australians have recently done one for them, mostly using statistics from their Federal Reserve Bank and Bureau of Economic Assessment. It's published in Dr. Oliver Haydorn's Lives of Our Own. So what does it tell us? The aggregate personal income of all Americans in 2014 was $10.1 trillion. The total consumer products delivered by their efforts was $12.5 trillion. The profit was $2.4 trillion, but the United States does not pay its citizens a dividend. If Americans want to consume the surplus of consumer products above their incomes, and they did, they have to increase their debt to the banks, which they also did. Federal Reserve Economic Data, FRED, tell us that while the American people's total wages and salaries in the 1990s amounted to over 50% of gross domestic product, they are now, in 2014, but 43% of GDP, $7.47 trillion, and continuously declining. It's not true that they are living beyond their means, for by their means they produced the whole of the $12.5 trillion of consumer products. They weren't consuming anything that didn't exist or that wasn't a product of their own efforts. They did it so well that they needed to be paid only $10.1 trillion by way of incomes to deliver the $12.5 trillion worth of consumer product. The reason that incomes are below the product's prices is the result of cost accounting practices, but we won't go there for now. The deficiency of purchasing power in the hands of proper persons to buy their own products is a fact. What can we do with this fact? We can either pay a national dividend or continue to increase our indebtedness to the banks. It really is that simple. Of course, there are unanswered questions about how this can and should be done. The most comprehensive single book on the subject is Dr. Oliver Haydorn's Social Credit Economics, which is available through Amazon. Be warned, though, it is 532 pages long, so you'll have to be serious about needing to know. And another fallacy. So, while we're about it, there is another fallacy that needs addressing also. This is the fallacy that there is a central organization or leadership among the world's money-creating bankers. This organization takes several forms. The favorites appear to be the Illuminati or other Masonic groups, the Bilderbergers or Zionist internationalists. A time was when there were probably only a dozen or so international banking houses, and they were pretty well known. Today there are hundreds. They now include Chinese, Japanese, Indians, Brazilians, Russians, and nationals of almost every country and of hundreds of religious and racial backgrounds who are administering, directing, and controlling the creation of money in at least some part or parts of the world. That they are centrally directed is a fallacy. They do, however, have a considerable degree of common cause. They enjoy the benefits of being able to create national monies, own them, and loan them at interest. They enjoy all this, however, only so long as other banking houses will accept their credit. Once other banks will not accept their credit, as happened to Lehman Brothers, they fall out of the loop and have to cease operations. For this reason, they are truly independent, and none will consider the creation of money on a debt-free and interest-free basis with anything other than horror. The profit of the U.S. national economy of $2.4 trillion must never be paid as a national dividend, and the people's profit can be made available to them only by their borrowing of increased debt from their banks. This is the extent of their collusion. In some countries or regions, and with some groups of banks, there's certainly more to it by way of social engineering and conditioning manipulation, largely through control of the major media to serve their agenda. From a world perspective, however, its leadership is both fractured and fractious. Attempts to dramatize the situation by overstating the influence of some particular group brings the actual situation, which needs every effort at exposure, into disrepute. Associating together for an evil purpose, the actual definition of conspiracy, is common to all men whatsoever who would defend an illegitimate asset or right. Bankers are included here. We would all crucify others to maintain our idea of our self-interest in the absence of sufficient moral suasion. Let's not go crazy. Let's not overstate the case to the point of making it ridiculous and indefensible. The truth is of itself sufficient, without exaggeration, to set us free. Let's trust the truth in its adequacy. Voltaire said that he only ever asked God for one thing, that he would make his enemies look ridiculous, and he granted it. Can I suggest a better prayer? Please, God, protect me from making myself ridiculous.